Your japa took you to your destination. You have arrived, you have arrived, you have arrived. And he said, in that moment, I reconnected with the self I really was. I understood that this passionate japa had in fact been a distraction, very pleasant, but nonetheless a distraction. He said, when I was a small boy, 6-year-old, I had a direct experience of the self. I didn't know what it was. When I came out of that experience, my mother, who was an ardent Krishna Bhakta, persuaded me that I'd actually had a vision of Krishna, and if I wanted to get it back, I should worship Krishna, which is what I did, and that's when the form of Krishna started appearing. But he said, I realized in Bhagavan's presence that this experience, which I had had when I was 6, was actually the full, complete experience of the self, and that in a way I had hidden it up with this lifelong quest to externalize the state into a quest for a physical form of God who could give me bliss, who could give me peace. So he said, I spent 25 years after that initial experience of the self looking outside of myself for a form of God who would give me bliss, peace and happiness. And what Bhagavan did for me was he made me realize that peace, bliss and happiness were inherent in me as my own self, and that I no longer needed to look for them outside of myself. He said, I became addicted to the form of God. I fell in love with the form of God. I got bliss from the form of God. But those particular experiences, they took me away from myself. I was still attached to the form. I was the seer of those forms, and I refused to let the seer go because the seer wanted to enjoy the bliss of those experiences. So he said after a few years after that, when I retired from my job, I started reading. I never had time before. I started reading all the great works of Indian spiritual literature. I read the poetry of some of the greatest saints of India, and he said, I found that many of them had the same story, that they'd fallen in love with a particular form of God. They'd spent years or even decades worshipping a God, having visions of God, having blissful experiences with God. And then he said, you look at these poems carefully, and he mentioned Tukaram. I can't remember the verse, but he said there's one Tukaram verse when he finally realizes that his addiction to form has been keeping him away from the formless. And he also had read Mirabai, who was a big Krishna Bhakta, and that although she had countless experiences of the physical Krishna, at some point she too realized that the true, highest, permanent state was formlessness, and she gave up her addiction to the form. He said, I was misdirected by my mother when I was 8 into external worship of a form that gave me bliss, peace and happiness, and it was Ramana Maharishi who took me back into the self, who showed me my own self, who showed me that there is nothing external to the self, and that there is nothing apart from the self that can give you any happiness greater than or different from the bliss of the self. He said that's the role of the true guru. He said all these amateurs in Madras, they were well-meaning, they'd read all the books, they'd read all the scriptures, but they didn't have the experience, and they didn't have the ability to look into my heart and see that my business was finished, that I no longer needed to chant the name of God, because that had worn down my jiva to the point where there was nothing left except self. He said it took a guru of the magnitude of Bhagavan who could immediately look at me and see that my sadhana was finished, to say with authority, you have arrived, and by saying that with the power and authority of the self, he put me in that state and established me there with such force and authority I never needed to look outside of it again for anything else. The moment that Bhagavan said, you have arrived, that was it. There was no more sadhana for him. He knew himself to be self, he was established as self, and he said, what Bhagavan did for me, that my practice never did by itself, and which no other teacher could ever do for me, was show me my own self, establish me in my own self, with such force and authority that I never ever needed to go looking for anything again. I knew that, as he'd said at the first meeting, God is the seer. God is not the thing you look at. God is the one who sees. I became established as that seer through the authoritative command of my master. I became established as that self, and he said I never wavered from that self again. What the force of Bhagavan's pronouncement did for me, he told me, is that he made me realize that there is nothing external to that self that needs to be desired or striven for. He said after that, forms of Krishna would still appear. He said it was my destiny to see gods a lot, but he said the compulsion to go looking for them, the addiction to the form, he said all that vanished with that final darshan of Bhagavan. He put me in a place where I realized that there is nothing external to that self, that I needed nothing. There was nothing to be searched for, nothing to be attained. He said that was my state. He re-established me in that state which had spontaneously manifested when I was a young boy, and he said I never needed to do sadhana after that. My practice was finished. So then the next part of that was, did he take to self-inquiry? And the answer to that is no, never as a practice. So when I first went to see him in Lucknow, I was trying to find out his story, and took a while to sit him down and get him to tell the whole story. It's a long, complicated story, but after he told this story, which culminated in the experiences I've just mentioned, he said, if I had asked myself, who am I, once when I was 6 years old, I wouldn't have needed to run around after the form of Krishna for those 25 years. He said, I was ready at the age of 6 to ask that question and get the correct answer, but instead I had a mother who thought that the experience was Krishna-based, and she was the one who set me off looking for Krishna. So once he began to teach, he appreciated from the direct experience he'd been granted in Bhagavan's presence that looking at the seer of phenomenon, watching that seer go back to its source and disappear, was a far more direct route to having a direct experience of the self than externalizing attention through an individual seer and seeing a form of God. So in all the years I knew him, he would say, ask yourself, who am I? Ask yourself, who am I? This is the teaching of my master. He didn't have an opportunity to practice this himself. He realized the self simply through the force of Bhagavan's power, the force of Bhagavan's grace, exterminating his already pure attenuated sense of I. So it was not a practice he ever did himself, but he did encourage almost everyone who came to him in later years to do this, saying, this is the teaching of my master, this is the most effective way to gain liberation. Then there's this really interesting question of when did he start to teach? Now the events that I have just described took place in 1944. He continued to work in Madras. He would come at weekends, holidays, enjoy sitting with Bhagavan, talking to him. In 1947 he was compelled by Bhagavan himself to go back to the Punjab to rescue his family who were caught on the wrong side of the border at partition. Bhagavan, he objected. He said, I don't have a family anymore. My family is you, Bhagavan. I don't want to go. All of my past life is a dream. I'm not involved in that dream anymore. To which Bhagavan replied, if it's all a dream, why are you scared of events happening in the dream? So Bhagavan always insisted that devotees look after their family, fulfill their family obligations. We've talked about this before. So he instructed Papaji to go back to the Punjab and rescue his family. So very unwittingly, Papaji told me that this was a conversation up on the hill. He said, I prostrated to Bhagavan on the hill, and I took a piece of soil from under his feet as a memento. This was the dust from my guru's feet. I left Ramanashram, went back to rescue my family, and in the turmoil of post-partition, he ended up with 35 of his relatives, most of them women, in Lucknow, none of whom, apart from himself, had any marketable skills. So he said I was working 3 jobs just to keep these people alive in Lucknow. So he never got a chance to come back to Tiruvannamalai again. So I asked him once, when did you start being a guru? This is the question you've asked me today. And he said, I thought he was going to say, you know, a year after I left Bhagavan, or something that made sense chronologically. And he said, when I was 8 years old. So he said that when he was a young boy, he fell in love with the Buddha. He said the Buddha was my first guru. He said, I saw a picture of the Buddha in one of my school textbooks, and it was the starving image. I think it's in the Lahore Museum, where he's just skin and bone. And he said, although it wasn't that attractive a figure, I just felt an immediate attraction. I knew nothing about the man, I knew nothing about the teachings, so my first reaction was to starve myself and look like him. And then I noticed he was wearing orange robes, so I stole one of my mother's saris, I dyed it orange, and I was secretly going around Lyallpur, that was his hometown, begging, because that's what Buddhist monks did. He said I was trying to imitate the life of the Buddha. And then he said, I read that the Buddha gave sermons. He said I knew absolutely nothing about Buddhism, but I went to the clock tower in the centre of Lyallpur. That's where all the politicians came and gave their speeches. I marched very confidently up the steps of the speaking podium under the clock tower, and I gave a lecture, a sermon on Buddhism. So I said, well, what did you say? You didn't know a single thing about it. He said, I don't know, but I remember standing there and talking very eloquently for a long time. So he said this ability to communicate has been there all my life. He said people have been coming to me, even though I wasn't fully enlightened. There was a kind of energy field around me. People have been attracted to me all my life, and he said I haven't ever been able to hide. Wherever I am, from a young age on, people have come to me for advice. So on another occasion, we had a very good, long, interesting discussion on what gives some enlightened people the power and the authority to wake others up. Some people can be enlightened, but they don't have the authority and the power to show other people and to put other people in that state. I said, where does that come from? And he said, if it's your destiny to be a teacher with that power, then you don't have to train for it. He said, training is for lawyers, politicians. They go and apprentice themselves to somebody else who knows their job, and they learn. He said, if the self has decided that it's your destiny to be a teacher, then that power comes automatically. You don't have to do anything. It's there, and whenever that power is needed, that power comes through you and does its work. He said, at some point I realized that was my job, that was my destiny. I didn't do anything to achieve it, anything to attain it, but I recognized that that power flows by me, through me, and affects other people.